Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. I'm happy to be here. I come from a country which has been a staunch ally of Hungary in World War I, what is more, in World War II, what is more, a country which has been at odds with the Serbians and Romanians, and a country that has never been mentioned since the beginning of this conference in the morning. I expected this, and this is why I put more illustrations in my paper, because Bulgaria usually is not well known outside of its borders. It seems difficult to believe that a bloody conflict like the Great War, with all its repercussions for Bulgaria, would be a subject comparatively neglected by Bulgarian historiography. This, however, is the dire truth. In the course of something like 3 decades in the 20th century, from 1912 to 1945, Bulgaria fought 4 wars, 2 of them in 2 parts, and lost 3 of them, a record, I think, unrivaled and not coveted by any other European state. In its war frenzy, it did not neglect any of the great powers. At different times, it challenged Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and the United States, not to mention all its neighbors without any exception. The wars, and especially the disastrous Great War of 1914-18 for Bulgaria, 1915-1918, though did not turn into a starting point for a soul search. The military exploits of the soldier in the field were hailed both by memoirists and historians. His record was claimed to be without reproach or blemish. The internal political enemy, the greed of the neighbors, and the egoism of the great powers were vilified and blamed for the defeat. The gory, often unattractive crux of the war, though, was brushed under the carpet of historical memory, and thus to the present day. The Great War turned into a harrowing experience for Bulgaria. Unlike the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, which started with enthusiasm and ended in despair, the Great War started with gloom and forebodings and ended in despair. In 1912, Bulgaria had a reputation of a country that moved ahead with big strides in economy, in culture, in education. It was the biggest and the fastest developing Balkan Christian state south of the Danube. The outlook of the nation as a whole was an optimistic one. Its army was considered by independent observers to be the best armed and the best motivated in the peninsula. Its future looked bright and cloudless. In fact, the former American President Roosevelt called Bulgaria the Japan of the Balkans, not because of its military prowess, but because of the fast economic development of the country. Only 6 years later, this image was shattered to pieces. World War I turned out to be the most disastrous war in Bulgarian history, both in terms of victims and territorial loss, and for its shattering impact on the national psyche. The dreadful firing power of the machine gun, combined with the territorial principle of conscription that prevailed before the war started, mowed down the men of whole villages with a long-lasting, devastating demographic effect. Even now, if we go to Bulgarian villages, you can see in a village of 200 people a war monument with about 50 names of men who perished in the war because they were parts of one and the same attack, and they were mowed down by the machine guns. The total mobilization that Nazi Germany strove for in World War II was almost achieved by Bulgaria 3 decades earlier. In the war, the country managed to put under covers more than 800,000 men, or almost 20% of its whole population. Not that this helped an awful lot. In September 1918, the exhausted country, threatened by an uprising of the angry soldiers, asked for an armistice. Its defeat heralded the beginning of the end of the Central Powers. In November 1918, the artillery cannonade on the Western Front stopped. For Bulgaria, World War I proved out to be what the American historian Barbara Tuchman called the March of Folly. Bulgaria was the only country in the world to enter the war on the side of the Central Powers after Turkey. The choice in September 1915 was dictated by the vindictiveness towards Serbia and Greece, who have managed to occupy most of Macedonia in the Balkan Wars, and the big promises of the Central Powers. It doesn't seem logical. The important thing should have been which side is more likely to win. But the Bulgarian politicians had an ingrate myopia. The government did not even send a military mission to the battlefields before taking its fateful decisions. It did not even attempt to evaluate the world scope of the conflict, looking at it in its restricted Balkan range. The only politician, Alexander Stambulivski, the leader of the Agrarian Party, who was then an opposition leader, he was the only man who said to the government in parliament, look at the United States, look what they're going to do. Nobody looked. According to the stipulations of the New Peace Treaty of 1919, the country lost around 10% of its pre-war territory. It does not seem much compared with the loss of Germany or the Ottoman Empire, not to speak of Austria-Hungary, which ceased to exist, but it was impossible to reason in this vein with the Bulgarians. That the losses were comparatively small than those of the other vanquished countries does not necessarily mean that they were just. Bulgaria lost to Serbia 3 major enclaves on its western border, with virtually no Serbian indigenous population. But even more important were the loss of southern Dobruja and the precious outlet to the Aegean Sea. When I was working on my PhD dissertation, somewhere down in the Paleolithic times, I worked with the papers of Sir Edward Grey in London, and I was amazed at the letter of the Serbian ambassador. Evidently, I did not see the letter itself, to Sir Edward Grey, and the answer of the secretary of Sir Edward Grey. Evidently, the Serbian ambassador had some demands to the British, and the secretary said, yes, of course, we agree. As regards Bačka and Baranja, Sir Edward Grey has no idea what this is and where is it, but of course he has nothing against having these regions for yourself. So this is how the borders were drawn. The war started a series of disastrous movements of the political pendulum, from the far left to the far right. The war dealt a devastating blow on the image of the traditional parties, blamed for the defeat and signaled the loss of influence for the traditional elite. The Bulgarian Agrarian Union, led by the charismatic Alexander Stambulivski, attracted the sympathy of the peasants who formed the overwhelming majority of the electorate. The Bulgarian socialists represented one of the oldest socialist movements in the region. In 1903, following the developments in some European socialist parties, they split into left and right. Up to the wars, the socialists were a negligible factor in Bulgarian politics. The defeat bolstered their influence. Now, they became the second strongest party in parliament. Some intellectuals who followed closely the developments in Italy and the rise of Mussolini suggested that the traditional parties have lost their credit, and what the country needed instead was a tight, comparatively small commanding center of right-wing intellectuals and the military who could serve as a rallying center of the right. The war hardened the already existing deep distrust of the politicians and politics in general. The war accentuated the image of Bulgaria as a staunch ally of Germany and a country set on revanchist goals which predetermined its fate in the next global conflict. The war signaled the sliding of the society into a spiral of political violence. The war taught the man who had spent 3 years at the front that in most cases, the bullet was the supreme judge. This culture of violence was in fact deeply rooted in the Bulgarian psyche. The belief that political problems might be solved by the gun reached its culmination in the two fateful years 1923-1925. On June 1923, a right-wing coup d'etat brought down the legally elected left-leaning government of the Agrarian Party. 3 months later, the communists who remained passive in the beginning were severely reprimanded by the Comintern and organized an unsuccessful uprising. In April 1925, again under the dictate of Moscow, they committed a hideous crime. A powerful bomb shattered the main Sofia Cathedral, St. Nedelya, killing more than 150 people. The war strengthened the lack of respect for the political adversary. After the coup d'etat, the Prime Minister Stamboulski was horribly tortured and killed. Hundreds of his followers were murdered. In 1925, hundreds of communists and left intellectuals were slaughtered. At the same time, communists and anarchists were slaying their political enemies. The war changed the attitude of many Bulgarians to the so-called Macedonian movement. For 40 years, the Bulgarians sacrificed money, did not spare efforts, started wars for the dream called Macedonia. All was in vain. The Bulgarians were ashamed to acknowledge it, but they started to tire. The national dream lost its credibility. The situation was not helped by the internal strife and the indiscriminate murders in the Macedonian organizations in the 1920s. The war sealed the process of a deep international isolation of the country, in the region and in the world. In Bulgaria, as elsewhere in Europe, a generation bereft of ideals and attracted to a cynical view of life emerged. The sons did not understand what is more. They openly mocked their fathers for their mistaken belief in great ideas like patriotism, fatherland, justice, moral. The war contributed to the development of a mindset of whiners and losers in many Bulgarians. The most cherished dream of Bulgarian foreign policy, its ultimate goal in the interwar years, became to avoid a new thrashing. The war left Bulgaria in the inconvenient situation of the major power bent on revenge in the peninsula, at least according to the neighboring Balkan politicians. This was only a theory. In practice, the country was too weak, the army was severely restricted by the peace treaty, it was poorly armed. In a word, it was not a military threat. The truth was that Bulgaria might become a probable danger. The war strengthened the already ingrained belief of Bulgaria being at all times the victim, the sacrificial lamb of the great powers, who were always ready to lay it lovingly on the altar of their interests in order to cut with a bloody knife the choicest pieces of its national patrimony. This feeling, by the way, is shared by most Balkan peoples. The war marked the end of the national revival of the Bulgarians with its hopes. As a result of the war, the predominant mood in art was of pessimism. Even the names of poetic collections spoke eloquently of the ambience of the time: mourning, withering black roses, funerary elegies. On the other side, the after-war years were years of unprecedented hedonism. Pubs, cabarets mushroomed in the big cities. The light musical comedies were the most popular entertainment, and the cinema went ahead with big strides. Theaters passed through a flourish unseen up to that time. The war gave birth to a number of useful legends that are still repeated in the textbooks and the media. The Bulgarian army did not lose a single battle. The Bulgarian diplomats did not score a single win. Not true, of course. The heavily outnumbered and ill-equipped Bulgarian army was routed in September 1918. The Bulgarian army was a disciplined one, leading a cavalier war against its savage enemies. Not true, of course. In 1917, the so-called Morava uprising of Bulgarian-occupied Serbia was put down with probably 20,000 victims. Bulgaria was the country with the biggest territorial losses. Untrue. In fact, it came out of the war with a small territorial gain. Bulgaria was devastated by the war, yes, but not to the extent of the neighboring countries. No major military engagements took place on its pre-war territory. Most of its albeit meager industry remained intact, unlike the factories of Serbia, Romania, or northern Greece, many of which were razed to the ground. The process of transition from wartime to peace, economy, and politics was smoothed to a certain extent by the fact that the majority of the population was made up of peasants. Living in the conditions of a self-subsistent economy, they withheld the rigors of post-war crisis better than highly urbanized Germany. Inflation never reached German proportions. Bulgaria had to accept the biggest number of refugees. Untrue. No one knows how many refugees came to Bulgaria. Estimates range from 150,000 to 400,000. It is true, though, that years after the war has ended, emaciated prisoners of war continue to trickle back in their villages. Sometimes bitter surprises awaited them: death of the most beloved, wives who have found new husbands, children who have forgotten them. The war was not forgotten in public memory. Public demonstrations for years commemorated the most important battles and especially its painful outcome. When the communists took power in 1944, it became a fact of which one was supposed to be ashamed of. The card catalogues of the libraries had the books on the Balkan Wars and World War I grouped together under the general subheading, quote, "The preparation of the Bulgarian bourgeoisie for unjust, imperialist, and annexation wars." After 1989, the situation changed. The restored Macedonian organization, IMRO, which turned into a political party standing more or less in the political center, and a number of fringe nationalist parties and groups, youth organizations, especially student organizations, tried to revive the memory of the war. In the last 10 years, the nationalist political party ATTACK managed to win enough votes to get into parliament and to attract thousands of unruly youths. In fact, at the moment, it is the main support of the government. The war remains a part of its political platform, but it is not a part of the agenda of Bulgarian society in general. Thank you very much.